Roy Hiroshi Matsumoto was born in Los Angeles, an American citizen, the son of Japanese immigrants. As a boy, he spent years in Japan with relatives and learned the language deeply, including regional dialects most Americans know. Then he came home to California and built an ordinary American soldiers did not know, and built it home to California and American life. He was, in every legal and personal sense, an American. His country was about to spend a great deal of effort telling him he was not. After Pearl Harbor, the United States forced roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them American citizens, out of their homes on the West Coast and into incarceration camps. Roy Matsumoto's family was among them. They were held behind barbed wire in a camp in Arizona, and it was from inside that injustice that the army came looking for men exactly like him. The military intelligence service needed Japanese Americans who could read enemy documents, interrogate prisoners, and understand intercepted orders. Matsumoto volunteered. He would fight for the country that had imprisoned his family, using the language that made him suspect, against an enemy that was, in some cases, his own distant relatives. There were 14 of these Japanese-American MIS soldiers with Merrill's Marauders scattered among the combat teams, and they were extraordinarily valuable. Early in the campaign, at a place called WWII, Matsumoto intercepted Japanese field telephone talk and overheard a sergeant complain that only a few men were guarding an ammunition dump, and unwittingly reveal its location. The Marauders destroyed it. Again and again, Matsumoto's ears turned the enemy's own words into American advantage, but at Nhpum Ga in April, listening would not be enough. He was going to have to speak. At the end of March, the Marauders were ordered to block a Japanese counterattack, and the 2nd Battalion won a desperate race to a hilltop village called Nhpum Ga, getting there just ahead of the enemy. It was high ground that covered an airstrip the wounded needed. They dug in, and within days the Japanese 18th Division closed around them and cut the trail behind them. The 2nd Battalion, a few hundred exhausted, sick men, was surrounded on a bald hill with the enemy on every side. Then the Japanese took the one thing the defenders could not do without. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. They took the water. The only spring on the hill lay just outside the perimeter, and the Japanese seized it and covered it with fire. Now the surrounded men were not just fighting the enemy and the jungle and their own sicknesses. They were running out of water, in the tropics, under the sun. They rationed what little they had. They cut the throats of the pack mules that were killed by shellfire and used what they could. Airplanes tried to drop water in, along with ammunition and food, and some of it drifted into the enemy's hands. The men on Nhpum Ga were being slowly strangled. The pressure was relentless. For roughly 11 days, the Japanese shelled the perimeter and threw infantry at it, probing for a weak point, attacking by day and by night. The hilltop was so small and so surrounded that there was no safe corner of it. Men were hit in their foxholes, at the aid station, everywhere. The dead could not always be buried, and the smell of the battlefield became its own kind of enemy in the heat. Disease moved through the weakened men, dysentery, fevers, exhaustion. By the end, the siege of Nhpum Ga would cost the battalion dozens of dead, and hundreds more wounded and sick, and still the perimeter held. It held partly because of too little howitzers. The Marauders had almost no artillery, but 2 75mm pack howitzers were broken down, flown in from India, and dropped by parachute onto the airstrip, then dragged up and reassembled. For the first time, the surrounded battalion could hit back with real firepower, dropping shells directly onto the Japanese massing in the trees. And it held because the rest of the Marauders, outside the ring, were attacking inward, striking the besiegers' own slant supply lines, hitting them from behind, trying to fight their way through to their trapped brothers. But the fight that mattered most happened at night, at the edge of the perimeter, in the dark, in Japanese. Every night, Sergeant Roy Matsumoto did something almost unimaginable. He crawled out of the American perimeter, alone in the dark, down toward the Japanese lines, close enough to hear them talk. He lay in the jungle a few yards from the enemy and listened to them plan, where they would attack, when, in what strength. Then he crawled back and told his commanders what was coming. For a Japanese-American soldier, being caught out there would have meant a death worse than most. There was no version of capture that ended well for him. He went anyway, night after night, and one night he heard them planning the big one. What Matsumoto did next is the heart of this story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We're just getting to it. Lying in the dark near the enemy lines, he overheard the Japanese preparing a major assault, a Banzai charge, a massed rush meant to overwhelm one stretch of the American perimeter at dawn. He crawled back and warned his battalion, and the Marauders did something clever. They quietly pulled back from the exact ground the Japanese planned to hit it and set up their machine guns to cover it, leaving the enemy's chosen killing ground empty and turning it into a trap. Then they waited, and Matsumoto stayed forward, close to the enemy, listening. Before dawn, the Japanese attacked. They rushed the empty ground exactly as Matsumoto had heard they would, and ran straight into the waiting American guns. The first wave was cut down in the dark, and then the charge faltered. The survivors went to ground, pinned, uncertain, waiting for the order to push on or fall back. This was the moment. In that pause, if the Japanese pulled themselves together and came again in strength, they might still break through. Everything hung on what happened in the next few seconds, and in those seconds, Roy Matsumoto stood up in the dark and started shouting orders in Japanese. He gave the command to charge, again forward into the guns. To the pinned Japanese soldiers in the dark, it was the voice of their own officer, in their own language, ordering the attack home, and they obeyed. They rose up out of cover and rushed forward once more into the American machine guns that were sighted and waiting, and the second wave was destroyed like the first. By imitating their command, Matsumoto had made the enemy attack the exact spot where they could not win, twice. When it was over, the ground in front of that part of the perimeter was covered with the Japanese dead, and the great assault on Nhpum Ga had broken. There is one more detail, and it is the kind of thing no one would believe in a film. Some accounts say that as the Japanese wavered, a real Japanese officer stood up to rally his men and countermand the confusion, and that Matsumoto's ruse had so scrambled their command that the attack collapsed into chaos before it could be saved. Whatever the precise sequence, the result was not in dispute. A veteran division's night assault had been turned inside out by a single American sergeant who could think and speak in their language, and who had the nerve to use it while lying almost within arm's reach of them. The broken charge did not end the siege by itself, but it broke the enemy's best chance to overrun the hill, and it bought time. Outside the ring, the other Marauder battalions were still fighting inward, exhausted men marching and attacking on empty stomachs to reach their trapped comrades. On the 8th of April, a battalion that had made a brutal forced march threw its last strength into another attempt to break through. Progress was slow and paid for in blood, and then, on the afternoon of the 9th of April, the Japanese did what the Marauders had learned they would do once a fight turned against them. They broke off and melted back into the jungle. Nhpum Ga was still American. The men who walked up onto that hill to relieve the 2nd Battalion never forgot what they found. The defenders were skeletal, filthy, hollow-eyed, many of them sick, all of them beyond exhausted. The siege had cost the Marauders dozens killed and hundreds wounded and ill. Of the unit's remaining mules, scores had been killed by shellfire. One officer wrote that after Nhpum Ga, the Marauders, all 3 battalions, just about to a man, were beginning to wear out. They had held, but the holding had used them up, and their war was not over. Their commanders would drive them on, sicker and fewer, toward one more objective. That objective was Myitkyina and its all-weather airfield, the real prize of the whole campaign. In May, the wreckage of Merrill's Marauders, sick with malaria and dysentery, hundreds of men held together by will alone, climbed a 2,000-meter mountain range and took the Myitkyina airstrip by surprise. It was the unit's final victory, and it destroyed them. By the time the campaign ended in August, of the roughly 3,000 men who had started, only 130 remained fit for duty. Of the men who had marched into Burma, just 2 are said to have come out never having been hospitalized for wounds or disease. The Marauders had been used until there was almost nothing left. Roy Matsumoto survived. He came out of Burma with the rest of the ghosts, having done as much as any single battalion alive. And he did it, remember, while his mother, his family, sat behind barbed wire in Arizona, imprisoned by the same soldiers as he had just saved. He never take the same government, soldiers at. He never made a speech about the contradiction. He simply did his job, better than almost anyone could have, and let the record speak. It would take that record a long time to be heard. He was, in the end, Every man who served in Merrill's Marauders received the Bronze Star, and the unit was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation. Roy Matsumoto earned the Legion of Merit for his work in the campaign, and his actions at Nhpum Ga became part of the legend of the Military Intelligence Service. The roughly 6,000 Japanese-American linguists whose work in the Pacific One senior officer estimated shortened the war and saved countless lives. For decades, much of what the MES did stayed classified, and their story stayed quiet. But slowly the record spoke. In 1993, Roy Matsumoto was inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame, because Merrill's Marauders are the direct ancestors of today's 75th Ranger Regiment, and their heritage is carried in the Ranger's own insignia. A Japanese-American whose loyalty his country had once doubted enough to imprison his family now stood enshrined among the greatest soldiers in the history of America's elite infantry. He lived a long life, told his story in his later years so it would not be lost, and died in 2014 at the age of 99. The men he had saved on that hill outlived the war because of him. Sergeant Roy Matsumoto of Los Angeles died in 2014, aged 99, a member of the Ranger Hall of Fame, honored at last by the country that had once locked up his family. The 2nd Battalion of Merrill's Marauders held Nhpum Ga for 11 days and lost dozens of men doing it, and their whole unit was spent to a shadow, taking the airfield beyond it. In 2020, the surviving Marauders and their families received the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, for what those 3,000 men did in the jungle. Most of them were gone by then. And in the mountains of northern Burma, the hill they called Nhpum Ga is just jungle again, quiet, with almost no one left who knows what it cost to hold it. A surrounded battalion, dying of thirst on a jungle hill. A veteran enemy division certain it would break them, and the American they had taught to distrust, who lay in the dark a few feet from them, spoke to them in their own voice and turned their courage against them. Roy men on that hill did not. The turned dast not. Just went home did not. They just went home alive. People still debate how much the Military Intelligence Service shortened the war, and how a country could ask men to fight for it while imprisoning their families, and how those men said yes. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in Burma, in the China-Burma-India theater, in the Marauders, or in the MIS, in any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The men who held that hill deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.